I have a couple things if there are no burning questions of things that we'll focus on. Good morning, all. How are you?
Good, thank you. How are you?
Good. I'm good.
Hi.
With a couple folks who are on, let me know, are there some specific things that you guys want to talk about? If not, I was going to talk a little bit about we talked a little bit last time, I think, with interviews. I thought what I would do is kind of use some of the things we talked about in interviews and talk a little bit about presentations. And because I think that those things are related. But before I launch into that, I just want to make sure that there aren't any other, if there's a topic that I could address that's more close to what you're interested in, I am delighted to address that question first.
Maybe we can talk about like how should we write a personal statement, but we can talk this about like in the next meeting too, so it doesn't matter.
I'm happy to let me briefly touch on that, and then what we do is come in and talk a little bit more about that. I'll definitely prepare a few things to kind of talk a little bit more about that. But as you start to think about personal statements, I think that that's a very important component of your application process. In terms of thinking about what to include in there, I think, there'll be some themes about what I talk about in the personal statement, about what I talk about in terms of presentations. A lot of your personal statement is really about a story, right? And what you want to be able to do is tell a story of a little bit about you, and what are the pieces that people want to hear most about. They want to know a little bit about where you were, where you are, and where you're going. So there's really kind of three components of that. And what they're really interested in trying to figure out is, like, if we understand where you were and where you are, and now have an appreciation of where you're going, are we the program that's going to be able to be successful in getting you to where you need to be? And so if you're looking at it from my point of view, or for someone who reads thousands of these personal statements, I'm oftentimes looking at those and trying to better understand whether the program I have is the program that's going to be able to launch somebody's career in the way that they want to do, right? So I'll give you an example, right? If someone writes in there that they grew up in a community setting, that they really got attracted to doing medicine because they were very interested in providing care to a group of individuals in a private community setting, and they went to medical school, and they really, really are eager to become a community gastroenterologist. And what they want to ultimately do is they want to go practice in a community setting and take care of patients. I think that's absolutely terrific. I will just say that I'm not sure that I'm the best program for that person, because our program is really focused more on academic medical practices, and really starting to think about how you include scholarly and discovery-based work into the practice of medicine. So if you're not really interested in doing research, or you're not really interested in education, or you're not really interested in kind of policy, I'm not necessarily sure that my program is the better program. Does that mean that that person who just said that they wanted to be a community gastroenterologist was wrong? Absolutely not. What that means is that they've made a certain choice, and there's really exceptional programs for where that person wants to be going. So as you go through the personal statement, it's really important to be able to kind of state what you think is really what you want to do and how you want to go about getting there. People want to see your passion, and we have to remember, when you're writing a personal statement, as you're doing that, you need to be, with any kind of document that you write, one of the other things, once you have some framework in terms of how you're going to go about doing this, is really to spend a fair amount of time thinking about who the audience is that is going to be reading it. So as a program director, what am I mostly interested in? And so I mentioned a couple of those things. If for some reason there's something in your record that doesn't make a lot of sense or that requires further explanation, there are big gaps in your schedule, you failed one of the standardized tests, but you took it over and you repeated it, don't make the assumption that people are just going to understand what happened, but you need to be able to provide it. You don't want to give excuses, but you need to give explanations in terms of what's going on, and what you learned from those if there were some setbacks or roadblocks. I spend a lot of my time also writing grants, and so one of the things is when we share data in our grants and preliminary data, we're saying that this is work that we think is going to support our ability to do that. But any piece of data that you have really does give you the opportunity to say, well, I'm not sure that that's the right way to interpret it. And so if you're always interpreting it in the best light and you're not really being critical of your own data, then it becomes a little bit hard to you're not seen as fully authentic in terms of being able to do that. So at the same time, your application, you want to highlight the good parts, but you want to acknowledge and address right up front any of the parts that may not be perfect, that you think need some further explanation. And so, I know that we rescheduled this meeting. I think that we were supposed to meet in January, and I rescheduled to February. And so I should also just state, I apologize that we had to reschedule. My mother passed away last month from COVID. And so if there's things that happen, and then life happens, and everybody understands that. But if that were to happen, or some kind of family event were to happen right before you took a standardized test, and that standardized test didn't turn out the way you would have expected, and you repeated and you did really well, then you should include that kind of information in somewhere, because we're all humans. We all recognize that life happens. And so as you're going through that, it's important to kind of include in that area. Others in the thousands that I've read, many times people start with a particular patient that they've seen, a patient that allows them to use some information about that particular case, that allows them to kind of weave in what they're passionate about, not only in terms of clinical medicine, not only the humanistic aspects of medicine, but also gives you the opportunity to kind of use that as a vehicle to tell people like where you were, where you are, and where you're going. And so oftentimes you can start with, kind of a very brief description of a patient. It really has to be brief. And then some people will come back at the end of that to kind of tell us a little bit about what happened to the patient, or how that patient impacted them, in terms of some of the decisions that they have made from that. So those are some of the things that I think are important in a personal statement. I can bring together, maybe what I'll do is in the next time that we talk, I'll bring together some personal statements, and we'll actually bring some personal statements that I can share with you, so that you can actually see them. And then I'll try to bring some that I think are particularly good, and we can talk about why they're good. And then I can try to share some that I think are not so good, and kind of go through why I think that they're not the best. It'll take me a little while to pull together some permissions, because I don't want to use anything I'll keep them anonymized, so you won't know. There's no way for you to know, but since I will be sharing this, and since it is recorded, I want to make sure that we have permissions from the authors to go about doing that. Does that sound like a good plan?
Perfect. Thank you.
Good. Excellent. So it does pivot, I think, a little bit in terms of some of the things we've talked a little bit about before in terms of presentation. So I'm going to try to share my screen, but before I do that, I'm going to leave you. I want you to kind of focus on a question, and that is when you guys go to a number of different talks. And I will just say, when you're interviewing, or when you're presenting yourself, or when you're presenting your work, you're going to be doing essentially the same kind of things. And I'm interested in trying to figure out what you think makes for a good talk. So just think in your own mind, what are the adjectives, or what are the things that you would think makes for a good talk? And then the second question is, what makes for a bad talk? Like, you've been to now several scientific talks or medical talks. What makes for a good talk, and what makes for a bad talk? And let me see if I can, if I'm permitted to share my screen. I'm going to show you. Can you guys see that? Do you see the title where it says "What makes for a great talk"?
Yes, okay.
Yes. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So I did this a while ago, and I had 35 people actually participate in what's called a word cloud. And this is the words that came up with when I asked people what makes for a great talk. And so the larger the word, the more likely, the more times that was the word that was repeated by other individuals. So you can see the largest word there is engaging. Second largest words are clear and concise. And then you see story, clarity, understandable. And then there's a number of other smaller words that are there that I think all kind of point to some general trends, right? What this tells me is that if you're going to give a talk, or if you're going to be, interviewing in those, these are the kind of things that you want the person who is listening to you, your audience, to be able to actually feel after they've interacted with you or they've listened to what you've had to share with them. And so so let's contrast that. So what does that mean for someone who, what makes for, a less great talk? I guess, I don't know which adjective I ended up using. Let's say what makes for a bad talk. So I'll just share with you the word cloud again from 37 individuals when I gave this talk not too long ago. But you can see some of the words that are there. Jargon, one of the larger words. Boring, confusing, disorganized, unclear, monotone, right? Some of the words that we saw on the first slide and some of the words that we saw in the second slide talk to content, and some of it talks in terms of delivery. So let's talk a little bit about content first, and then we can talk a little bit about delivery. So content, if we go back to this first part, really starts to talk a little bit about clear, clarity, understandable, good slides, illustrative, right? So when you're giving a talk, and again, I'll say scientific talks and interviews, I think are really very much in these same areas. You really want to focus on making sure that you have something that's going to be understood. And another word that I really loved on this one was story. So it's always good to try to figure out how to tell a story. Whether you're doing that through a scientific theme or whether you're doing it not only in terms of what you're doing for your interview, it's important to tell a story. Because if I were to start telling you a story, about our let's say our interview process, I could go through and download a whole bunch of facts that wouldn't be very engaging to you. But if I told you, like, this is how we do it, and let me walk you through this process, and gave you this opportunity to feel like, oh, there's a beginning, there's a middle, and then there's an end. It allows you to start to be engaged with me in terms of thinking about what that story might look like and what am I trying to provide. And I would hope that when I'm the person who's preparing this, that I've already thought about what are let's say the three most important things that I want the person who is hearing this talk, what are they going to be able to take away? Three things. So if you're giving a scientific talk, you should be able to say, I want them to think about this, idea one or conclusion one, conclusion two, and conclusion three. If I'm in an interview, I want them to make sure that of all the things that I have emphasized, they know that I'm a hard worker, they know that I'm dependable, that they know that I'm interested in doing kind of scientific work eventually, as part of my career. And so those are the kind of things that you'll end up kind of seeing or hearing or wanting to kind of make sure that you've included, in that part. Am I still sharing my slides? You still, no, did they drop off?
No, we can see them.
You can see them. Okay, perfect. Thank you. And so what becomes hard in the thing, again, we're going to focus just right now on the content, is jargon, right? So much of what you might talk about, especially when it comes to scientific things, is that I'm going to tell you about, and I'm as you may know, I'm an immunologist, so jargon is so easy for us, right? I can tell you about CD82, CD63, IL2, IL8, TLR9. I can come up with so many different interleukin cytokines, proteins that fit on different cells. If I think that you're starting to catch on to what I'm doing, I might even actually come up with new cells that you didn't know even existed. I can really get you lost in the weeds of immunology. If you're not an immunologist, it is so easy to get confused with immunology, right? So if I tell you this whole story, right, if I'm telling you a story and I'm going to tell you about, I'm just going to make it up, CD82, which happens to be a molecule that I work on. If I launch in and tell you a lot about, the function of CD82, what is, how is it working and all of its partners and what is it doing, I need to introduce it as a character, right? If I was writing a novel about this, it would be my main character, right? If I was writing a detective book, I would treat it as so I need to give you some kind of idea of who that main character is and build it up. And during my introduction, I need to be very specific about who are the other things that I need to make sure that I include in that process. So as you're going through and trying to develop that talk, it's going to be really important to start to think a little bit about the introduction, not as an introduction to the field, but all of the information that the listener needs to know before they start to understand and appreciate your data. And so that may not be the kind of the general compendium of all of the things that they need to be able to be aware of, but it is something that they will be able to kind of figure out from that point of view. Avoiding jargon means that you've defined many of your terms. And if you think that everybody knows that, that's fine, and you can skip it. But even if you think 2 or 3 people in the audience may not know, chances are you need to define it and make sure that people understand it. The second component of a lot of this is really in terms of how you do the delivery. We talked a little bit about content. We talked a little bit about making sure that you have the information. You tell it as a story. You introduce the appropriate characters as you go through this. The second part is really about kind of delivery. How many of you have actually watched TED Talks? Have you gone on to watch any of the TED Talks, right?
Yeah.
If you've watched TED Talks, almost none of the ones that you remember used crutches. They didn't have cue cards. They didn't have, it didn't sound like they had memorized anything. What it sounds like when you watch a really incredible TED Talk is it sounds like it's a conversation. It sounds like someone is kind of telling you something and you're listening with rapt attention, trying to understand what they're going to tell you and what the thesis of what they're doing. It looks completely unrehearsed. It looks like they're doing it in a very spontaneous way. And I will tell you, and I will submit to you that the best TED Talks you've heard are some of the most rehearsed talks on the planet. They've rehearsed it to the point that they know it so well that they can give it in their sleep, and they can do it, and they have all the kind of the verbal crutches that they need. They know when to pause. They know how to use their hands. They've done it repeatedly so many times that it's become second nature to them. And so as you start to think about and presenting something, you really want to be able to prepare and give practice talks and have people give you feedback, not only in terms of some of the transitions, but also in terms of thinking a little bit about how you are and whether you sound engaging or not engaging in that particular area. And then the last thing I will share with you, let's see if I can continue. I'm going to stop sharing that and see if I can share with you another one, which is really kind of more of a scientific point. And I'm going to see if I can share this. So I'm now sharing it. This is a slide deck now from some years ago, and it's really not very important about the content. I really wanted to share with you as you're doing a scientific talk. So one of my postdocs wanted to know a little bit about what I thought was kind of the better way to really approach a talk. I thought she gave a reasonable talk, but I thought it could have been a little bit better. And I said, in science, what we do is we ask questions. And so I said, one of the ways to do this is to set up, as you're doing this, is to set up what is your question. So in this particular slide, you can see the top of it really talks about the question. This is the scientific question that she was answering. And so the second part of this slide really then talks about what was the nature of the experiment that she did to be able to actually demonstrate what she wanted to show. And then she asks some follow-up questions. So this slide really does then set up the data. So here's the data. The question is TLR9 recruitment dictated by phagosomal content? And then she answers the question in the next title. TLR9 is specifically recruited to Aspergillus fumigatus phagosomes. Again, the content isn't as important, but she asked a question, and then in the next title, she answered the question. She now shows the data that supports this conclusion right in the middle of that slide. And then finally, what she then does at the end is ask a new question. So any good piece of data is going to ask another set of questions. So she now asks these questions here and says, okay, well, now that I've seen this data, it forced us to start thinking about this particular type of question. And the next thing is she answers that question and then shows the data and allows you to kind of come into what I would consider to be a fairly, a repeating cycle that allows you to start to say, here's the question. This is the experimental setup that we did. This is the data that we have for this particular answer. This is what we think is going on. And by looking at this, we were able to kind of then think about new sets of questions. So as you start to think a little bit about, how you present your work, it's helpful to kind of think a little bit about some of the things I shared with you in those word clouds, what makes for a good talk. And you can see how 35 people who were all in science were thinking about that. What makes for a bad talk, and when people get lost, what is the first thing that people do when they get lost? They pull out their phone, and they're right in the audience, and they're just on their phone because this is more interesting and exciting to them than what you're saying. And so you've lost audience members when that happens. And so being able to then kind of convert that and being able to say, okay, like, how do I keep that? It's by telling a story. And it's by continuing to share that and giving a specific framework in terms of by asking questions, because if your audience is there for the talk, they should find those questions after you've introduced all of those concepts. Those questions should be interesting to them and they want to know the answer to it. And if they keep listening and they keep following along to your story, they're going to be able to understand that. And that's going to how you're going to be able to deliver that data in an engaging and a clear way. You saw relatively few words on a lot of those slides, especially when they included the data. The data was really meant to kind of speak for itself, and you walked the audience through that data. All right, so that wraps up a little bit of what I wanted to talk about in terms of kind of effective communication, in that area. Let me pause and see if you guys have questions or thoughts about what I just said. Excellent. So the next time, and again, I encourage any one of you to reach out to me, send me an email. If there's a topic that you want me to include in this, just send an email and say, hey, it would be great if we could talk about this topic. I'd be happy to do it. The next time, if I can get the permissions, I will have the 2 personal statements and we'll walk through the personal statements. And we'll talk about some of the details about a specific personal statement, what I thought was particularly good about one, and where I think the other one kind of lost its ability to be helpful in terms of conveying that information. Sound good?
Sounds good.
Yes, perfect.
Sounds
Thanks.
Excellent. Nice to see all of you today. All right, please keep in touch.
Great, doctor.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Have a good rest of the day.
Take care.
Thank you.